Jessica, the program manager for Greensboro Bound. Welcome to our fourth and final Crimson Letters conversation here this afternoon. We have had to postpone this event from June, and Tessie's going to give us a little information about why that had to happen. But I'm so glad that we have been able to reschedule. And Tessie Castillo is with us today, along with John Powell. Tessie is a freelance journalist based out of the Durham area, and of course, the author of Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row. She's here with us today. Her co-author, Michael Alim Braxton, will be joining us in a little bit, calling in directly from Death Row, and we'll be able to speak directly with him. We also have John Powell with us, who is from Campbell University's, Restorative Justice Clinic. So he's basically our resident expert for today. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to John to tell us a little bit about himself and the work that he's done. And also I'll remind you now, and I'll remind you again as we move through the event, we will have the opportunity, or you'll have the opportunity to ask questions both of Tessie, John, and of course Alim via the chat. So when the time comes for that, you will look in the chat, send it to Greensboro Bound instead of John or Tessie. That way I can direct those to them, those questions. So again, in the chat, send it to Greensboro Bound. And we'll get to that a little later on in the conversation. But again, to start, so John, if you could just tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into this field, so on and so forth.
Okay, thanks Jessica for having me, and Tessie, thank you for inviting me to be a part of the series. Well, I'm a lawyer. I came to be a lawyer a little bit later than most. I was 36 when I enrolled in law school, 39 when I graduated and started practicing law. I had my own practice, primarily doing criminal defense work, and pretty frustrated pretty quickly with a system that really is not designed to meet the needs of the people that get brought into it. Offenders, victims, nobody wants to be there. It really is focused on the offense and the offender and what kind of punishment do they deserve. And that leaves out so much. So every day in court, I was pretty frustrated because I became a lawyer because I wanted to try to help people get in a better place. And I was having a hard time doing what I really wanted to do. I was introduced to this notion of restorative justice by a man named Tony Baker, who was a new law professor at Campbell. My office was directly across the street. I met his wife before he came from Pepperdine because she came out first to find a home for them to live in, and so I couldn't wait to meet him, and he introduced me to the notion of restorative justice. He wanted a clinic in the law school. I wanted something to serve the community better, and so those two desires came together very nicely. And our dean was supportive, and our chief judge was supportive. The Governor's Crime Commission gave us our first grant money to start. And so we started a clinic in 2003 to serve the juvenile court. And that came out of frustration of me representing kids that got in a system that they had a hard time getting out of. And so we plugged along and were pretty successful for the first couple of years. We then expanded and started serving schools, which was a desire of mine too, because this thing that we call now the school to prison pipeline is a very real thing. And we were seeing kids being sent to the courts from the schools, and it was just a bad situation for everybody. So we gave schools a resource other than the courts. And since then, the law school actually moved from Harnett County to downtown Raleigh. That was a big sea change for us and for our programming. And we've expanded quite a bit. And so we do work in the adult criminal courts as well as the schools and the juvenile courts. We were invited, as Tessie has said in other segments of this, she was invited by Dr. Coons to do the work that she did in Central Prison. I was also invited by him, and he just flashed on my screen, so I'm glad he's here. I think the world of him. Hey, brother, good to see you. And he invited us kind of as a test drive in the general population at CP because he really wanted us on death row. And so after the first semester, we spent the next 2 semesters on death row. And that's where I met Alim. He was in one of our circles, and it's just been a remarkable journey that I've been able to be a part of.
On mute.
There we go. Gotta always unmute. Thank you, John, for being here with us today. I really do appreciate your time. So now I'm going to send it over to Tessie. Tessie, if you could just tell us a little bit about your background, you know, how you and John have worked together before, and then also you can tell us a little bit about Alim as well, and again, getting into why this event was postponed in the first place.
Sure. So I'm Tessie Castillo. I'm a writer, live in Durham, North Carolina. And I have been working in criminal justice reform for about the past 10 years, largely as a lobbyist here in North Carolina. Did a lot of work in criminal justice and drug policy reform as a lobbyist. I actually got into death row specifically, though, by accident. Dr. Coons, who's on this call, was someone I just happened to run into at a Super Bowl party, of all things. And we started talking. He told me about some amazing programs that he was helping to get going for guys on death row who previously didn't have really any programs or outlets that could really help them heal and work through things in prison. So I asked if I could volunteer to teach a journaling class, and went through the process of getting approved and got into the journaling class. And the men that I met, I was just so blown away by the level of insight and wisdom that I found in the little room. We had these really intense conversations because they were writing about their pasts and how they got to prison and what life was like in prison and what gave them hope and purpose while living under a death sentence. And so after a while, I was no longer able to continue volunteering to teach at the prison. So instead, I started writing letters to the men. And just, again, came up with these piles of incredibly insightful letters that I felt it was really important to share with other people instead of just keeping them all for myself. And so I proposed the idea of writing a book with 4 of the guys who I had been corresponding with. And we ended up writing Crimson Letters, which was a 4-year process. And they tell their own stories. They're all incredible writers. The book has very minimal edits from me, honestly. And so they tell how they got there and what it's like and what they're trying to do with their lives moving forward, because none of them are just taking a death sentence lying down. They're all trying to be better men every single day. And you're going to hear from Alim, especially, who's gone through a really remarkable journey of who he was when he started and who he is now. I'm really excited for you to hear that. The reason that the event was postponed from June was because Alim was very abruptly thrown into solitary confinement in June, and he was there for 37 days. And so we've only now been able to reschedule. And I'll let him tell you a little bit about why that happened and what it was like for him. He was actually previously in solitary confinement for almost 10 years. So being put back there was especially traumatic for him because of all of the memories that it brought up. But I'm really excited to be here. I'm almost glad that it was postponed because it gave me more time to focus on recruiting more folks. And I'm glad we have so many people. And I know Alim's excited. I talked to him yesterday and he's really pumped to do this. So thanks for having us.
All right, thank you, Tessie. So John, I'm gonna come to you for our first question here. Can you tell us, restorative justice, what is it? And how is it different from the criminal justice system?
Well, that's really a great way to ask it. And restorative justice is a theory of justice that understands that when crime is committed and when wrongdoing happens between people, it is law-breaking, and the state recognizes that. But it is much more than that. It does damage to people, to relationships, to communities. And that's the part that our traditional system is not designed to address. You can boil it down to 3 basic questions on both sides. In the traditional system, the questions are: what law was broken, who did it, what does that person deserve? That leaves out so much because when crime is committed, people are hurt. And that hurt needs to be addressed in some way. One way that I've heard it said, I've heard Fania Davis say this, I've heard Howard Zare say this: if crime causes harm, justice should create healing. And so we need something to come alongside a traditional system that is not designed to meet the needs of people that are hurt by crime. And that's what restorative justice is. The 3 basic questions that it asks are: who's been hurt, how have they been hurt, what do they need to find healing. And so we work to bring people together if they desire to do that. There are a couple of pretty steadfast principles about restorative justice. One is that it should always be voluntary. It makes sense that you would never force a victim into a situation where they had to sit down and meet with their offender. Likewise, if an offender does not want to do this for the right reasons, you would not want to force them into a situation where they could do more harm. So it has to be voluntary. And it really depending on where you are in your case, and a lot of the cases that we do that are outside of the court or diverted away from the court, we need to provide confidentiality because offenders need to be able to admit wrongdoing without fear that that's going to be used against them in a punitive way. As a criminal defense attorney, when I was representing people in court every day, one of my first pieces of advice was don't talk about this because anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. And what we know is that if we cannot talk to each other, we are not going to find good resolutions and find healing in these cases. And so defendants in a traditional system have a constitutional right not to incriminate themselves, not to talk, and they're advised by their counsel not to do that. In a restorative justice setting, if we're going to do pre-adjudication cases, we have local rules that have been adopted by the court that don't allow statements in mediation to be used against people because the purpose of restorative justice is not to punish, is to try to understand harm and create healing. So I hope that gives folks a pretty good understanding about the differences of a traditional system and a restorative justice system.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Tessie, back to you. So prior to publishing Crimson Letters, you were a lobbyist for criminal justice reform and drug policy reform, which means you often had to interact with opposing parties on either side of an issue. How important was it for you to hear the stories from both sides and then know that legislators were then going to form policy or laws around these issues and having seen, A and B of it?
Mm-hmm. There was a lot being a lobbyist that surprised me. I think once you actually see how the sausage is made, you can't really unsee that. And one of the things that surprised and disappointed me was, although of course you do have a two-party system, and so there should technically be opportunity for debate and to hear both sides of an issue, when you actually get into it, there's a lot of effort from both parties to push bills through without letting the other side really talk about how they see the issue. There's just always trying to push through what you want to push through, and it's not really about having a healthy debate or looking at the issue holistically or even being fair, but it's often mostly about winning political points. So I think it's really important for us as citizens to understand that our voices need to be heard at the legislature, and they're often not heard. But you can actually just walk into the legislature and talk to anyone there about whatever bill is important to you. So if there was a criminal justice legislation or something involving restorative justice, it would be really important and really helpful for you to show up at the legislature and talk about the issue from your point of view. Or maybe if you've had involvement with the criminal justice system, to go and talk to them about what the system is really like, because often they have a very myopic view about what criminal justice is, and they don't really see the people and how it affects the people, or they don't understand that there are alternatives, that we don't just have to have new laws and harsher laws and lock everybody up, but there are things like restorative justice. So it's important to have those voices there, because the way things are set up now, there's often not room for that healthy debate.
So speaking of there only being two ways, this way or that way, restorative justice offers this third way that, seems to be making some headway, but is often not always considered. So John, I send this question back to you. What are some of the state laws and prison rules that prohibit restorative justice circles from taking place?
Well, it certainly is not written into the code in the state law. The only place that I've seen it exist is it's listed, victim offender dialogue is listed as a resource within the juvenile code. But it just says that that is a place that certain cases can be sent. No funding for it, no protocols around it, no specificity around procedure and that sort of thing. So, you know, we have created a restorative justice clinic where we can actually provide the service to folks. And we exist in Raleigh, and we serve primarily Wake County schools and Wake County courts. But we'll go anywhere when people ask. I mean, I have done cases in Durham County, Buncombe County, other cases like that when people make a request. At the prison level, I'll give you a couple of examples, and Linda Simmons is on the call, and you probably will hear Alim talk about Linda and the impact that she had on him in the circle. Linda's son was murdered in 2004, and Linda came to me through a friend and who had talked to her about the Restorative Justice Project and about victim offender dialogue, and she was considering whether she would want to meet with the man that had killed her son. She ultimately decided that she did, and so we began having that conversation. I reached out to him in prison. He'd been sentenced to prison. I reached out to him through a letter, told him about Linda and about the request, and asked him if he would allow me to come and sit with him and talk about it. He said yes. The prison granted my visit. Met with him, had a really great meeting. I knew that he and Linda were both great candidates for victim offender dialogue. So we weren't ready to have the meeting between them, but we were ready to start the process, and because I knew that the prison would have to give permission for us to have that meeting, for Linda to come in and have that meeting with him. So we started that process, and we pretty quickly got told no. Well, there's not a protocol in North Carolina right now to do this kind of work within the prisons. I can understand their hesitancy. I can understand them saying no. They don't have an understanding of what this is. And we actually have been told no on 2 occasions when we've asked to have the victim offender dialogue. I'm very happy to report, though, that under new leadership at the top in the Department of Corrections, we have been, I don't think Tessie talked about this a while ago, but we both were uninvited from continuing to do our work at Central Prison several years ago. But I'm finding that there's a new day, and we have been, the Restorative Justice Clinic has been re-invited to do this work again. As a matter of fact, we actually held our first circle on death row last March before the pandemic hit us and everything got shut down. So we have been re-invited. We had established 2 circles at Women's Prison, 1 back on death row at Central. There has been a desire and a commitment to create protocol in North Carolina so that victim offender dialogue can happen and people don't have to be scared of this anymore. And the way that I've always seen it is that it should be a victim right. If a victim wants to have this dialogue, and if there are folks in place like the folks in the Restorative Justice Clinic that can do this with fidelity and integrity, I don't think the state should be able to tell a victim, no, you cannot have this. And we have leadership now that sees it that way too. So I'm very happy about that and looking forward to the changes that are going to be coming pretty soon.
It seems that a lot of the pushback would come from both fear and ignorance. People just don't understand what it is, and they're afraid of what they think it is.
Yep.
That just leads to nothing happening. But this next question is actually going to be for both of you, and let Tessie, I'll let you answer first. But what are some of the wider scale issues or challenges when it comes to adopting restorative justice circles?
So one of them is remorse. The guys on death row are my co-authors. Many of them are not allowed to talk about the crimes at all because their cases are still being appealed. And for guys on death row especially, the cases can be appealed for 20 years, 30 years. And so during that time, they have to almost treat it as they would before they went to court, which is that anything they say can be used against them. So they're not permitted to admit to any guilt for fear that it might jeopardize their cases. So that's a major obstacle for both restorative justice and I think just a sense of accountability and honesty with themselves.
And John, for you, what do you see as some of the broader reaching obstacles?
Well, we've been so entrenched in this huge traditional criminal system that we have in our country for so long, and it's been based on punishment. And it's not just in our justice system. Back when we first got started in 2003, our school systems were largely operating under a zero tolerance policy. And a lot of that came about through events such as Columbine and thrust law enforcement into our schools. And in the beginning, law enforcement were doing what law enforcement had been trained to do. They were law enforcement in the schools. And so many things that otherwise were not criminalized became criminalized. And I think that has built and fueled this thing that we now call the school to prison pipeline. It took me a year and a half of having conversations with school officials before I got an invitation to come in and start doing some restorative justice work in the first high school that we ever worked in, and that was at Triton High School down in Harnett County. So there's a pretty stringent mindset, and there has been a pretty stringent mindset around using punishment to address infractions and bad behavior. That's hard to overcome. I mean, we have huge systems that are designed around that. A lot of money that is thrown at that. A lot of jobs that are created to enforce these kinds of things. A lot of people under supervision in our country. One of the worst in the world as far as having people under supervision and entangled in our criminal legal system. So there's a mindset to be overcome. There are rules that need to be changed. But we are seeing change. And I think we're in a season right now where we're going to see, I hope we're going to see more drastic change and a whole lot faster than we've been able to see it before. I think people are seeing the benefit, or maybe I should say the detriment of only punitive systems and the benefit of systems that allow us to sit at the table and have conversations and understand each other better. So I hope we're in a new day. I believe in seasons. I think the season for these kinds of things is arriving, and I think some of the fruits of the labor are beginning to be born in this area.
Would you say that one of the reasons why we have this mindset of being, quote, tough on crime is because it focuses on the retribution, and because the stories we hear are only one-sided? We only ever hear a victim story. Not that hearing their stories are not valid, but we never hear what may have led to the perpetrator to do their crime.
Well, I do think that that's a big part of it. And, you know, this term justice is we've got to expand our understanding of what justice is. Even law students that come into law school have a very narrow view of what justice is. That's why I start my semester within the first week or two looking at a very difficult case. And I say, in this case, we're going to have some discussion around what does justice require. I want to expand the view in these future lawyers' minds of what justice is and what justice requires. Most people, and watch the news tonight, and you'll see people who have lost a loved one to murder, or someone has committed a crime. And what do we say? We say, we want justice. And for most folks, what that means is we want the perpetrator to be caught and prosecuted and put in prison. That's what justice is. But that leaves out so much. And it goes back to those three questions that I said restorative justice asks: who's been hurt, how they've been hurt, what do they need? So I hope that helps.
Tessie, I asked the same question of you because I know that you work with your co-authors and you've heard their stories, and perhaps before you worked with them, you never heard their stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, it's definitely true that every time a crime happens, we see the mugshot, we hear gory details of the crime, which is what everybody loves to hear. and there's no sense of what happens to bring the person to that place, or what should they do to actually atone for what they've done, other than just serve time in a warehouse. So it's really important to hear both sides of the story, and that was basically the purpose of Crimson Letters, is to give at least these specific co-authors a platform so they can tell who they are and how they got there and how they've changed since they've been there. And if people still agree with the death penalty after that, that's fine. But I feel like that decision would come from a much more authentic place than if we only see the bad and make a decision based on that. So it's really important. And I know for my co-authors, the opportunity to be able to tell their stories authentically and honestly has been really life-changing for them. And to be able to be on these kind of calls where they're talking to people and there's a real dialogue of open-mindedness and curiosity and learning that's taking place, it's huge for them.
So by its very nature, restorative justice takes place after the fact, after something has happened. And, you know, a lot of the things that factored into the crimes were apathy, otherness, or the dehumanization of the victim. So John, I ask you, because you just said kind of you're teaching these new lawyers to expand their view of justice. So within that kind of reframing and reteaching, do you think that there's a way to do a preventative restorative justice that can help restore the sense of connectedness that we have to people and to our own humanity and the humanity of others to prevent crime before it even occurs?
I do. I don't know if it fits nicely within the traditional definition of restorative justice because, as you said, most restorative practices are in response to something bad that has happened, and we're trying to identify the harm and trying to bring folks together to create healing. But there's a very important practice that we use within restorative practices called circle process. We use that in the prison as part of what Alim was a part of. And what that primarily is used for is to build relationship, to strengthen community. And that's what we were doing within the prison. Give people an opportunity to tell their stories. As Tessie was saying, it makes a difference when you hear someone's backstory, so they can hear each other's backstory. They begin to have an understanding of maybe why people get to the point that they get to. Even in restorative practices, when you bring victims and offenders together, they can hear that from each other. So it's not just a victim hearing how an offender got to that point. It is an offender being able to enter into a relationship with a person that they have offended against that for them at the time may have just been an opportunity or someone they didn't even know about, and begin to understand who they are as people and make a more human connection. It makes all the difference in the world. So these circle processes, and I'll just give an example of what we do in schools. We teach schools how to do this for themselves, and it's all about strengthening relationship of staff, faculty, administration, kids in school, so that when you have conflict, and we're going to have conflict, right? I mean, Dr. King talked about creating the beloved community, not a beloved community where we don't have conflict, because we know we're going to have conflict as human beings, but a beloved community such that when we do have conflict, our resolution of that is not to try to defeat each other. It's not a win-lose proposition. It is to try to understand each other and love each other and solve the problem and come out on the other end, hopefully being even closer than we were before. And so we use this very powerful circle process and using a talking piece, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that, and maybe Alim will talk a little bit more about that. It gives everybody in the circle an opportunity to be heard. It has a very equalizing effect. People that otherwise would never say a word in a room know when it's going to be their turn. They're always going to have an opportunity. So I think the circle process is a great restorative tool to do what you're talking about, Jessica, which you're talking about. How do we prevent things? Well, we prevent things by building relationship and understanding each other better, I think.
I think Tessie, it looks like Tessie is bringing Alim in. She can give me the thumbs up when he is officially on the call. I just have one more in this vein before he jumps in. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to ask this next question. So restorative justice, I mean, even for me personally, and I think as you've said, it really sounds like kind of this amazing opportunity for healing and growth, and a way to, you know, bring parties together who otherwise would just be sitting on separate sides of a courtroom and always be in an antagonistic situation. Given the healing power of restorative justice, why are prosecutors so resistant to restorative justice programs? Does it just go back to the whole idea of ignorance and fear?
I think largely it is, and you know, ignorance sounds like such a dirty word. I guess I'd rather say naivety and just not understanding. Being so bound in a punitive system for so long that it's hard to see a paradigm that's outside of that. I tell you though, I know a lot of great prosecutors that are great people, and are interested in hearing some better ways. And I have not tried to knock down brick walls. I have tried to go through doors that are cracked open, and that's what we've done. And in doing that, and in going where people are open and receptive, I think that's the reason that we've been able to grow our program as much as we have.
All right, John, so I'm going to toss this question to you, another one back to you. Considering the racial divide here in America and the killing of unarmed Black men has shown basically the culmination of just, you know, huge amounts of racism, systemic racism. Is there a way to use restorative justice principles in training of officers? And is there a way to create a space for protesters and police to tell their stories to each other?
Well, yes, I think so. And, you know, this notion of community policing emerged in our country several years ago. I know that a former Raleigh police chief brought that concept to Raleigh several years ago, and it was about being in the community, creating relationship. I mean, to me, creating relationship is the key. One of the best restorative practices that we have to be able to do that is the circle process. So inviting folks into that are on all sides of an issue to be able to talk in a structured way and a safe way. And a big part of the circle process is in the very beginning, building a place that people do feel safe, that they can speak their truth, whatever that is, even if we have differences of opinion. One way that we do that is we decide together how we need to be treated by each other. We let people create their own values and guidelines around how we're going to be treated. We do a values exercise very early on in the circle process. And by the way, circles are not a one and done. I'm not talking about getting a group of people together to do a 1-2 hour circle and then we're through. The example that I use a lot is in the prisons. We go in 1 day a week, 2 hours each time, the same people every time, the same room. Consistency is critical because we don't build safety in a day. It takes a while. And the more contentious the issue, the more time that we need to be able to build that safe place. And circle is a good way to be able to do that. So we may suggest some guidelines like listen to understand, not to respond. What is said in circle stays in circle. We need to promise confidentiality so that we don't hear our stories out on the street and we know that we haven't been violated that way. We do a paper plate exercise around creating values where we ask everybody to write down a few values that they need others to bring into the space to make it a safe place for them. And then we pass a talking piece and share those with each other and talk about why they're important. So and then there's a getting acquainted process. So we don't start by saying, tell us your deepest, darkest secrets. We might start by saying, if you were some kind of animal, what kind of animal would you be and why? And then we can work in a progression to get to some of the deeper relationship issues and then some of the more controversial issues in a safe way. So yes, I think that can be a very effective tool. People have to be willing to slow down because it's not a fast process, but it's a very good process.
Thank you. All right, y'all. So Alim should be with us now, and we should be able to hear him. Alim, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties before. My name is Jessica, and I know you know Tessie quite well, and John Powell, who I think you know as well. Thank you for being here with us today. Just so you know, we have about 60 people listening. We have about 60 people with us, so that's pretty amazing. If you would tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my name's Alim. As you know, I'm on death row. I'm a co-author of the book Crimson Letters. I've been incarcerated for about 27 years now. Just recently got off lockup, solitary confinement after 37 days, and for something bogus that was unjust that I'm still in the appeal stage on. And I also am an MC. That's been my passion for probably the most consistent thing in my life. And I'm happy to be here today talking to you.
All right. Yeah, we're definitely happy to hear from you. We've been waiting to hear from you for a couple months now, so I'm glad that you're able to join us today. So speaking of your most recent experience in solitary confinement, can you just give us a little insight as to what that was like for you? And I know that you previously spent 10 years in solitary. In what way was your most recent experience similar to that which you previously experienced?
Yeah, so for starters, it was totally unexpected, and being that for the last several years, definitely for the last 8 or 9 years in particular, I've been pretty much a model inmate, and so to be thrown in lockup unexpectedly, it was kind of a shock, and I didn't have any idea what I was being held in lockup for. In fact, nobody even communicated anything to me for the first 17 days. And so, I mean, it's one thing if I knew that I had done something wrong, that I had, committed some type of rule violation, but I had absolutely no clue, So for those first 17 days, it was very distressful. I tried to speak to many of the, lieutenants and the sergeants that were in the power and authority on the Unit 1, which is the lockup unit. But, no one seemed to, even know why I was locked up or seemed too concerned or cared why I was there. So that was very upsetting, very distressing. And, because I had been accustomed to, certain, what we would say privileges for the last several years, one being the use of the telephone, being able to speak to my mother, on an everyday basis, being able to talk to my wife, and, she's going through some health issues, being able to talk to my family in general and some of my friends, is that it was very, difficult just being, seized like that and thrown in lockup and, not having any ability to communicate with them because all of my property, they kept all my property, so I didn't even have a postage stamp, so I had to, kind of like barter some of my food from my food tray just to get a stamp so I could write home and, let it be known what was going on. And then to feel like, out of all of the, progress I had made over the years, to be right back feeling like I was in square one in lockup in this dark, dirty cell, and, completely alone with nobody that I knew, nobody that cared about me, and, completely shut off from communication. It was very upsetting. And, and it didn't take long for me to kind of remember, the attitude down there, the mind state, what garners your attention and what gets you dismissed or looked over. And I'm pretty much a calm kind of guy. I don't raise my voice too loud or make too much noise. And, if you kind of have that position, you get looked over. Nobody going to pay you no attention. The attitude on lockup is you got to, kind of be, rowdy. You got to kick on the door, make a lot of noise, or, let it be known that, hey, I'm here. And, so it was just, being in that mind state again, it kind of like just animal type, mind state of, being captive and et cetera. It was just brought back so many memories. And then, of course, just seeing some of the attitude shifts from the officers, on death row, because the environment here is pretty stable. There's not a bunch of turnover. You come here and you're usually here for 10, 15, 20, 30 years before your cases, either, you know, you end in execution or, you know, overturn of your sentence and a new sentencing hearing or a new trial. So the people here kind of, you know, it's a stable environment. And so the officers, you know, we get to know them, they get to know us, and it's kind of a mutual respect because, you know, you work with people and see them on a consistent basis, and, you know, the population here is kind of aging, so it's very little problem. But being on Unit 1 is that the attitude shift was a totally different, you know, it's a different type of mind state. So just seeing the aggression from some of the officers and just seeing the hostility and seeing some of the acts that I had recalled, you know, from years of being there, you know, just unjust, you know, attacks on inmates. I saw a guy, I was there within the first 2 weeks, and I saw a guy who went outside for rec, and while he was outside, one of the sergeants came in and just took his mattress out of his cell for no known reason. I don't know why the sergeant did it, but when the guy came back, he wanted to know where his mattress was, and, you know, nobody would give him any answers, so he did what he could do, was kick on the door to try to get attention from the sergeant. The sergeant came in with a big fire extinguisher-type mace can, maced his whole cell up. The guy was wheezing. The officer cussed him out, told him to shut the fuck up, and don't kick on his door. And the next thing you know, the sergeant walks out. And I'm sitting there like, you know, man, they just killed George Floyd. And, you know, it's the same type of mind state that they, you know, still conducting back here. I mean, this was literally a couple of weeks after George Floyd had been killed. And I'm just sitting there, you know, living and being back in the midst of this environment. And, you know, just all of the fears that, you know, I had experienced from the multiple years of segregation just all started coming back to me. So that was just, you know, just the tip of the iceberg of some of the experiences that I had on this recent 37 days of solitary confinement.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I know that none of us can possibly understand any of that experience. There's no way. So thank you for sharing and for giving us some insight. When you were in solitary previously, so I know this time was very sudden for you. It was kind of like you were just snapped up and thrown in. So when you were there before, was it a similar situation? And also, how did you find a way to cope with being in solitary confinement for 10 years? I can't even imagine 37 days, but having to live like that for 10 years. So how did you get through that?
Yeah, you know, honestly, you know, it broke me. You know, I'll be honest with you. By the time I did finally make it out of solitary confinement, is that I was literally on the point of, you know, of form of suicide. Is that I was ready to give up my life. That I can't say that I coped. I made it. You know, throughout that process, it was a stage of deterioration. I mean, there may have been a few years where I used, you know, the solitude to, you know, be introspective, to, you know, to try to have some type of growth and deal with some of the emotional wounds that I may have had, you know, that was still, you know, causing me distress and pain in my life. But there was definitely, you know, a period where I had, you know, grown very dark. I had sunk down into a state of despair, and I didn't see any, you know, light at the end of the tunnel for myself. I didn't see any hope, and, you know, being in the environment which my predominant, you know, emotion was fear, and that's, you know, to me, that's the description of my experience in solitary confinement that I describe most is, you know, because it was very brutal. You know, and just being, you know, just blatantly honest is that, like I said, is that the attitude, the mind state of the guards there is just a different type of mind state than, you know, regular population guards. You know, they're a lot more aggressive. They talk to you a lot more harsh, and they're, you know, very quick to use force. And so being there and seeing that on a constant, and I mean excessive force, you know, inmates getting literally, you know, hit in the head with batons and getting staples in their head and stitches and getting teeth knocked out, and, you know, for, I mean, some of the slightest violations, for, like I said, kicking on the door or, you know, throwing some liquid on an officer, or just because the officer don't like them, you know what I'm saying, and he might have said something slick to him and the officer just don't like it and feel like, okay, I can get an opportunity to straighten this out. And so just being in that environment and seeing that on a day-to-day basis for years, it made me very, very paranoid. It made me very distrustful. That the fear was in me that was so heightened that, you know, I definitely got to a point where, you know, my mind was very disillusioned, and it became extreme in thinking and how I responded. So, you know, it was only by the grace of Allah when I did get off lockup that, you know, I was able to make it off before I completely, you know, just sunk into the point where, you know, I did commit suicide.
Yeah. I imagine that after having that experience, Tessie coming in and meeting her probably was like a breath of fresh air. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in writing Crimson Letters, and if that kind of helped you heal from the trauma that you had been experiencing?
Yeah, so, you know, by the time I, you know, met Tessie, I think it was maybe 2014-ish. I had been off lockup, because I did get off lockup in 2014, so I had been off lockup about 10 years. And by that time, as I had, you know, I had healed quite a bit from the experience of solitary confinement. I had healed quite a bit, as, you know, just from the trauma that I have experienced in my life, personal traumas, and just some of the emotional wounds, like I mentioned, that, you know, were left unhealed from a young age, and that, you know, I was able to finally, you know, work through. So by the time
you have 60 seconds remaining.
On cue. So by the time I met Tessie, I was, you know, I had began the process of working through those things, and I had discovered, you know, quite before that writing was a way for me to, you know, kind of work those things out within myself. And so meeting Tessie and having an opportunity to kind of fine-tune that process, that's kind of what happened in 2014-ish when I met Tessie. And
you have 30 seconds remaining.
It was a very short meeting because, you know, Tessie ended up getting kicked out of the prison. But, you know, once she got kicked out and, you know, reached out back to me and a few of the other guys that were here and, you know, established pen pal relationships and friendship. And, you know, the process of, you know, the idea of writing a book came about. And I was a little resistant to it at first, but, you know, I eventually warmed to it.
Okay. I know you're about to get cut off, so we'll pick back up with you in just a few minutes. But thank you for everything so far. Okay, so while Tessie gets Alim back on the line, John, I'm going to come back up to you for a couple more questions. So we'll just jump off here. Obviously, Alim is an adult, and everyone that we've been speaking to in this series is adults in very, you know, severe circumstances. They're on death row and wouldn't necessarily have an opportunity for a restorative justice circle. With that in mind, why is it mainly practiced in the juvenile system?
Well, I think it's a safety factor for the people that are in charge. And I'll just give you an example. When I first started talking to the powers that be, and quite frankly, we need the cooperation of the authorities because that's where our referrals come from. We need the schools to be able to buy into it because they send referrals from the schools. We need the courts to buy into it because they send referrals from the courts. So we work hard to create these relationships. When we first started talking about this concept in Harnett County, when we were trying to get funding for a clinic and talking about the concepts, people are not as hopeful for the adult population in our criminal system as they are for our young people. And so most people are willing to give kids a second chance, and it feels safer to be able to do that. You know, this tough on crime mentality that predominates within our adult system doesn't necessarily predominate in our juvenile system. And I think that's one reason that it was able to spread so dramatically from the courts into the schools when they recognize that it does have these great benefits and we can actually keep kids from populating our criminal legal system. So once again, I think it goes back to a safety factor. We had been running our program in the juvenile court in Harnett County for about 3 years when I went to the chief judge and asked if we could expand up. And okay, I'm gonna stop because I think Alim is back.
Yeah, I'm back.
So John was just speaking, so I'm actually gonna to shift us to your experience with restorative justice. So you participated in a restorative justice class. What was your attitude towards the crime and the victims of the crime when you started the class? And then how did you change as you went through the class?
So I participated in the restorative justice. I had no idea what restorative justice was before I signed up. I kind of had an attitude at the time is that I just wanted to be involved in as many programs as were made available to us at the time. And so I signed up for restorative justice. But, prior to signing up is that I had definitely, reached a point in my life where I had, established remorse, and I felt, a great deal of remorse, in fact, for the crimes that I had committed. And when I signed up for restorative justice and, just kind of got into the group, met John, and, talked with some of the other guys, I mean, even though we live here, amongst each other, things regarding our crimes and, our personal experiences, a lot of those things, aren't really talked about amongst us. So just having a circle of, people that, was established, we had like a safety zone where we just felt, safe and free to, kind of open up about, the things that weighed on our hearts and our minds, is that it was an experience that was truly weightlifting, and it was transformative in the aspect of just being able to unload and emotionally. I definitely found a lot of emotional relief in the restorative justice group.
So I have a quote here. I'm going to read a quote from your section of the book. You write, "I have cried and cried real tears from my soul out of remorse for the things I have done, the lives I took, the innocent families I have hurt. There was a time that all I could think about was how I could make amends for the things I have done. I talked to my lawyers about contacting the families. I wanted to apologize to them. I am truly, sincerely sorry for what I have done. I even felt that I would end my appeals if they wanted me to die to make amends for killing their loved one. All of that is still there, but again, I am exhausted by remorse. I'm exhausted by everything involving those crimes. I don't have anything left to give. My tears, my grief, my sorrow, my dignity, my very spirit, this ongoing torment has taken it all." Can you talk a little more about your experience with remorse and how your attitudes have changed and how being public about your remorse has affected you?
Sure. So, I learned, I guess at a very young age is that, I guess it's just a human, is that we have some type of switch in ourselves that, we're able to turn off emotionally to cope, to survive with whatever, trauma or experience that we are experiencing in that time. And so, when I was out in society and, I, became involved in a life of crime, is that, naturally, is that I'm not viewing the victims as, family members or loved ones or people that I knew. So, shutting off that switch and just, operating in a position of, this is just a person that, has money that I want, is that was my state of mind. And it wasn't until I was locked up, I was arrested, I honestly did not feel any remorse, anything, as I was committing the crimes. They were just, I didn't know these people, so I had nothing invested to feel sorry about. And it wasn't until after I was locked up, and I recall I went to trial for a robbery. They tried me separate on a separate robbery in order to establish an aggravating factor so that they would be able to use as, in pursuing the death penalty. So as I was being tried for this robbery, it was a woman that I had robbed. She was a taxi driver. And we went to trial, and this was in September of '93, I recall. And I remember as I was sitting in trial, I hadn't seen this woman since the day that the robbery had happened and hadn't really thought much about it. And as I was sitting in the trial in the courtroom waiting, is that the bailiff came in because she was supposed to come in to testify. And the bailiff came in and, spoke to the judge and, said that this woman is terrified. She's afraid to come into the courtroom because I'm sitting here, at the defense table. And, for the first time, it kind of alarmed me, and I thought about everything. And finally, the woman came in, and I saw her, she was trembling. And she came in and she got on the stand, and she started testifying about things that the district attorney was asking her about who she was as a person. And as I listened, that this woman was from Africa. She was a native of Kenya, and that she had immigrated to America to pursue her education. She was a student at NC State, that she had 5 kids, and that she had, began, driving taxis as a way to supplement income to take care of her family. And then on this particular night when I had crossed her path and robbed her, is that I had terrified her more than she could ever imagine and the more that she can express. And I saw the tears and the pain as she testified. And as I listened to this woman, all I could think about was, what if this was my mom? What if my mother was sitting up here and I knew the hardship that my mom had been through? And I'm listening to this woman, and for the first time in my life is that I see and I'm hearing that this is a person, a mother, a student, someone who's, out there trying to do something to take care of themselves and their family, and they ran across somebody like me, somebody who had no regard, no concern, no care for the things that, were important to her. And for the first time, it just sunk into my heart, and I felt so awful. I felt so terrible. I felt like, truly the worst person on earth. And I said to myself, I said, man, how could you do this? How could you do something like this to this woman? And, at that moment is that I felt for the first time what I could ever express as remorse. And I knew that I felt genuinely sorry for what I had done. And, likewise is that grew on me throughout the years, is that I also experienced, because this was the first trial that I went through. It was a trial before I went through the capital trials. So when I went through the capital trials, it was the same thing, is that remorse continued to grow as I listened to the testimony of victims, family members, and how, they were harmed by my actions. And it just weighed on me so heavy. And this is my experience, my beginning experiences of remorse, and it just weighs so heavy on my heart. And I did definitely, and I still do, as I mentioned, definitely wanted to make some effort to, make some type of amend. I don't know what I could do, what I could say to, at least give some type of closure, if any closure could be given in regards to these situations, these murders, is that I wanted to have the, ease of my heart to know that I have done everything in this life to, to try to make amends for the crimes that I've committed. So I did talk to my lawyers about, what could I do? Is there anything that I could say? Is there anything, because, during my trials, I didn't testify, and I didn't take responsibility like I know that I could have taken. I was young, and I was, definitely trying to escape punishment and, even conviction for the crimes that I had committed. So I didn't, take the type of responsibility that I later realized I want to accept. I want to accept responsibility for my actions. And in the years since is that I have made some efforts in that regard. Since the Restorative Justice group that I was in with John Powell, is that I did reach out to my attorneys, and through some of our efforts is, I've wrote letters to some of the surviving victims and some of the family members of the victims as well, in an attempt to take responsibility for the crimes I committed.
Thank you so much, Alim, for sharing with us your kind of transformative process that you were able to go through to kind of come to a place of feeling remorse for the victims of your crime. So thank you for sharing that with us. John, I want to take this next question to you. You've taught several restorative justice classes inside prisons. Can you tell us what teaching these classes is like? Do the attitudes of the participants in these classes generally change? Do you think that the inmates find remorse through these classes? And what was it like specifically working with Alim?
Well, let me first say to Alim, it is so good, Alim, to be here with you and to hear you, and I miss you. A great treat that I had before the pandemic came and everything got shut down, I was visiting another person on death row, and as I was leaving, I saw Alim. He was having a visitor, and I was able to just turn and wave, and So Alim, it's good to be with you again. I miss you.
You too, man. I got a big smile on my face right now, but go ahead on and speak.
Well, I do too. I sure wish I could see you. I have seen the picture that Tessie used of you to advertise this. And I just want to tell you something, brother. You and I are a lot grayer than we were when we were together about 6 years ago.
All right.
Jessica, there's nothing common about a story on death row. Now, is it common that most of the folks that we work with find remorse, sometimes before, sometimes during the circle process? Yes, that is common. But there's nothing common about each individual's journey through that. And Alim's is one of the most moving stories that I have ever heard. I guess I want to let the viewers know right now that a person that made a huge difference in Alim's life in the circle is Linda Simmons, and she's on the call. If you want to hear Linda Simmons' story, and if you want to hear her read a very moving letter that Alim wrote to her after hearing her story, just go on YouTube and search Linda Simmons, Lynda Simmons, and you can hear her tell her story. And hear
You have 60 seconds remaining.
But yes, it's common to hear remorse. It's common that a lot of times they come to it from hearing stories like Linda's story. And it's such a shame that we have men sitting on death row, probably forever, that have come to those points in their lives.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and instead of asking Alim another question, because I know he's going to get cut off,
You have 30 seconds remaining.
I'm going to take it back to you, John, and leave it with you until he comes back on the call. How do racial issues come up in restorative justice classes, and how are these issues addressed?
I'll tell you something that I do in my class is I'll show different documentaries, but one that I show that is really powerful is called The House I Live In. And that demonstrates the systematic way that we in America have discriminated against all kinds of folks, not just black and brown people, but all kinds of folks. It is alarming and sickening at how systematic our criminalization of certain segments of our society have been. And it is shocking to most law students to see that. They have not heard it. It's hard, when they hear it, it's hard to believe. But this documentary lays it out in a way that it's you can't deny it. And so that's one way. And then we process that. So we process everything that we experience in circle in the classroom using a talking piece. And so we watch documentaries, we read articles, we see what's happening on the streets in Raleigh and other places, and we process those things. And it's just critically important that these future lawyers have an understanding about what's happening, so that, because they're going to be a part of the system and they have an opportunity to make a difference. And so I want them to go out there with their eyes wide open.
So while Tessie's getting him back on the line, I just got a comment from, I'm going to say Joya Karen. She said she was in a circle with you and Alim, and she wanted you to know that she's here watching. So, all right. So I'm just going to pause here, you guys, because I think Tessie's going to be back in just a second. We probably won't have time for John to get very far into a question. Those of you, so for the next part of this, oh, hey there, he's back. Hey, Alim.
Hello?
Can you hear me? Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to just speak to the audience right quick. So if you guys want to start sending the questions that you may have, either for Alim, for John, or for Tessie, send those to the Greensboro Bound in your chat box. That way I'll see them and then I can ask. So I'll go ahead and tell you, it's likely I won't be able to get to everyone's questions, but I will do my best. So if you just want to go ahead and start sending those in, we'll get to those here in just a few minutes. So Alim, I want to come back to you. So in your experience in the restorative justice classes, how did the racial issues come up, and then how were you able to address them?
Well, honestly, I can't say that, in the restorative justice group that, I can recall any racial issues coming up. In the group, like I said, it was very, much of a safe place, and, everybody, allowed themselves to be vulnerable. So, I definitely don't recall anything racial or any racial experiences that I can recall coming up in the circle.
Okay. Well, then we'll move on to the next thing. I'm going to ask this of you first, and then John, he can speak to his experiences. But how have you been able to give back to the victims of crime? What have you personally been able to do in whatever limited way to give back?
Well, like I said, I reached out to my attorneys, and I told them, that I wanted to make some effort to, make some type of amends for the crimes that I've committed. So, my mitigation specialist, Stephanie Boyce, is that she recommended that I write letters. That would be the first stage, to write letters, and she would then contact the surviving victims and the family members of the deceased, and see if they would be interested in receiving a letter from me, because we certainly weren't going to just thrust a letter on someone that may not be interested in receiving a letter. So I did write letters, and like I said, I took full responsibility, and I wanted to place myself in a position where I wanted them to let me know if there was anything that I could do, or if there's anything that they wanted in regards to justice, in regards to crimes that were committed, is what could be done to, make amends for it. And, thus far, at least one of the surviving victims, she did say she would receive my letter, but she made no promises that she would read it. And some of the family members, one of the family members of a murder victim, is the family said that they had forgiven me, and the other family members, we could not contact them because the person was from Nigeria, so he had no family or any relatives or anything in the U.S. So that's what I've done thus far.
Has anyone written you back at any length, or has it just been a simple acknowledgement that you wrote a letter and that was the end of it, or have you had any further correspondence with anyone?
Yeah, I've had no direct correspondence from anyone. All of the correspondence or communication has been through Stephanie. Stephanie's talked to several of the family members and victims themselves on the telephone, and like I said, one of them did say, I will receive the letter. She received the letter, but she made no promise that she would read it. And the family who said that they would forgive me, is that she talked to them on the phone. They did not want a letter from me, but said that they had forgiven me many years before.
Right. Alim, so I want to let you know, we have a couple of people who are on the call here that basically just want to say hello to you. One here, I believe her name is pronounced Joya Karen. She says hello, and that it's really good to hear your voice. Dr. Peter Coons is also here with us, and he says he wants you to know how very proud of you that he is, and for the work that you and others are doing in the face of so much opposition and everything that you've gone through. He's very proud of you. So lots of comments like that for you from folks. Lauren Cook says hello. Nancy Jones says hello. Linda Simmons says hello. Linda says something that was very impactful for her and played a big part in her own healing was her experience with you in the circle. Your letter to her was very validating, and the experience of connecting with you in such an intimate way was profound. You are surrogates for each other in the restorative justice process. So just want to pass those words on to you. here. You've got lots of people listening in today who are so grateful that you've been able to come and talk with us. Again, to our audience members, if you have any more questions for either Alim, he won't be with us for much longer, so if you do have anything you want to ask, please go ahead and send those to me. If you have questions for Tessie or for John, obviously send those in as well. So I'm going to take this next question, will actually be for all three of you, but Alim, I will start with you. I'm assuming that you're able to kind of keep up with things to a certain degree. So other than restorative justice, what are some examples of criminal justice reform that you've either heard about or in some way been involved with that seem promising to you?
Well, I can say, as of now, just the climate, just, the protests and the activism right now seems promising. Just some of the discussions that are being had, things on when, it was a lot of, energy towards abolishing the police and what was the defunding the police a couple of months ago. And I mean, that's a, completely radical, idea or concept, but the fact that it was even, discussed on such a national level was encouraging. Not that I support that, particular perspective, but the fact that people were willing to think so outside the box to try to solve some of the problems that, are prevalent amongst, police brutality, that was encouraging, that, we've reached a point, or people in society have reached a point where, we are actually examining every possible alternative and not leaving no stone unturned on how, we can tackle some of the issues that are, wrong or unjust in the system. So in that context is that I can't say anything in specific right now that is happening, but the fact that discussions like these are happening and that, activism and protests are happening and discussions about criminal justice reform are, actually occurring, throughout the country, that's very encouraging and motivating because, I do believe and I'm very hopeful that, there will be some change in, the current criminal justice system.
What gives you hope? Like, what are you hopeful for? What gives you hope? Kind of what helps you get through your day?
My faith, absolutely. I'm very grounded in my faith. As like I said, through my, experience in lockup, the 10 years I did on lockup, I literally, there's no question about it, I lost my mind. I got to a point where I was so irrational, so paranoid that, there's no sanity that I can find in that. So, it's definitely through my faith that, I have been able to cope, and I'm still coping now. As far as hope, because I ain't sure if you said cope or hope, right? So I'm just going to keep on rolling with it for right now, right? But as far as hope, is that, I am very hopeful that, some of the, wrongs as far as the system. One thing, just to add, is I just noticed in the paper yesterday, I don't know if anybody else noticed, but I think his name is Larry Demery. He's one of the two kids that was charged with killing Michael Jordan's father, that he just got paroled, or he'll be paroled in 3 years. And, a lot of people may not, have knowledge of this, but it was that very case in North Carolina that ended up changing what was called the Fair Sentencing Act and, bringing in what's called structured sentencing now, which did away with parole. And, so the fact that, the very catalyst for changing what was previously the sentencing structure and the parole system in North Carolina is that, now somebody is, the very guy who was responsible for, this being changed is being paroled because he was convicted under the previous sentencing structure, is that, I'm hopeful that this type of awareness will, make people say, well, hey, wait a minute. We've been doing it like this for so long, but, perhaps there's another way where we can address, mass incarceration and the death penalty and et cetera. So I'm hopeful of that.
Indeed. And yes, I was asking what makes you hopeful. Hopeful with an H, yes. But obviously,
okay.
You have to cope as well, cope with a C. So thank you for answering both of those.
All right.
I have a couple of questions from the audience. Are you able to share how restorative justice has helped you with the other inmates in the hope of again, with hope, with the H word, helping them with their own healing. Are you able to share your experience?
Oh, absolutely. I've definitely done that. In the years, I've also been the imam, which is the spiritual leader amongst the Muslims here on death row for 8 years until, as of late, with this recent solitary confinement. So, and in that capacity is that, that's definitely a role and, conversations that I had frequently with people, is that, because I had a leadership position in, the Muslim community, is that, several of the inmates would come and talk to me about things in their personal lives as well as their crimes, etc. And I've definitely been able to share the experiences that I've had with restorative justice and the desire to accept responsibility for my crimes. In fact, in this solitary confinement bid, that I just did recently, it was a guy down there who was locked up for raping a 13-year-old kid. And the sergeant came down there and just exposed him in front of everybody, said, you locked up for raping this child. And, it just caused pandemonium. All the inmates on the block wanted to kill him, wanted the COs to kill him, etc. And the following day, I came out for rec, and the guy, he was literally, contemplating suicide. He had a big bag of medication and was telling me that, he was going to over-medicate. So, I felt like, oh, man, I'm between a rock and a hard place. I don't want to, be overly sympathetic towards this guy and all the inmates turn against me. But at the same time, I felt a moral responsibility to, talk to him and give him some type of counsel. And so, in my faith is, we have what we call tawbah, which is similar to the steps of, restorative justice. It's, what is the equivalent of repentance. And so I advised him that, the first thing he has to do is to accept responsibility for the things that he's done, to acknowledge.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
So, I did have the discussion with him, and that was another aspect of sharing, restorative justice.
Okay, I think that is it. So I just want to ask you really quickly, and again, thank you so much for being here with us today. For our audience, if there's one thing that they could do, one action item, one thing that you would want them to do out here in the vein of restorative justice, what would you tell them to do?
You have 30 seconds remaining.
Continue to keep the conversation going. Continue to spread the message and talk about, the issues that are going on in the criminal justice system as well as in society. Keep the conversation going.
All right. Thank you so
before
much.
I go, I want to thank y'all for having me. I definitely want to say thank you to Dr. Coons. None of this could even been possible without him. And thank you for everybody else that, took their time to listen to what I had to say today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us. Take care.
Love you, brother.
For the audience, just you heard Alim mention that he had been an imam on death row, and because of his most recent stint in solitary, he was actually stripped of that title, which means, I'm assuming it means that he won't have as much access or won't be able to provide, at the same capacity, spiritual guidance to his fellow inmates, which is really unfortunate because you heard him speak today, and he obviously has a lot of compassion and a lot to share and a lot of faith that can help people. So I'm not sure. Tessie might be able to speak more to that, if that's something that can be restored or not. But anyway, so again, that was another one of his several punishments, long-lasting punishments. So not only did he spend the time in solitary confinement, he was also stripped of other things as well that will have longer-lasting effects. So Tessie, if you want to speak to that.
Sure. So what happened is that the reason he was put in solitary confinement was because he's a musician and he puts out his music. That's a big part of how he heals and how he maintains sanity, is by creating music and putting it out there. And there are some friends of his on the outside that help manage social media pages for him so that he can promote the music. And he was locked up because other people were managing social media pages for him. So it wasn't anything that he had done. It wasn't anything offensive that was on those pages. It was just the fact that they existed. There's no specific policy against having social media accounts that are managed by people on the outside. And there are actually a lot of people in prison who do that as a way of staying in touch But that was what happened to Alim. So his title of imam was taken away. He got 6 months without visits from family, and his family is really a lifeline for him. They're very involved and very loving towards him. And also canteen privileges were taken away for 90 days. So it was really a heavy punishment for something that he didn't even do. So that's very indicative of the prison system and the way that it works. The rules can be arbitrary. It doesn't really matter if you do it or if you don't. It's just, if they want to come down on you, they can.
John, I have a question. I want to back up a little bit, but I have a question from one of the audience members for you. And I wanted to save these until Alim wasn't with us so that we didn't take up his time. So paraphrasing here, there's someone here who's an educator who had a teaching career in inner city Detroit. She is torn when she sees the way that educators become fearful towards suspended students and those students that have displayed aggression towards others. Let's see. As a result, many school hallways exist where students, there's this palpable fear when they're walking through and there's these other students there, and some students get away with aggression as basically the administrators throw their hands up because they don't know what else to do. How can you protect others without being too punitive, especially when students seem unwilling to change?
Well, you know, I've thought a lot about is there a good reason to suspend a kid? And I think there is, and I think safety is one of those reasons. I don't think suspension should be the only thing, though. If a kid is acting scary and threatening and acting out, it is likely because they are receiving that kind of behavior themselves. I think we said earlier there is something that is driving all kinds of behavior. At some level, we all are offenders and we all are victims. I do think, though, that safety is a primary concern, and sometimes I do think a child might need to be removed from a situation if they are a safety risk to others. But like I said, I don't think that should be the end of it. And I also think that we can use restorative practices to help people to re-enter into a school environment in a safe way. And I think that in a lot of times we can help to build a supportive community. We can help to understand what is it that that particular child is facing that is making them to act out the way that they're acting, and try to build a supportive community around them.
So Todd Ishii, who is the new North Carolina Commission of Prisoners, you mentioned him earlier, I believe, talking about you had done a restorative justice circle back in March before the pandemic kind of shut everything down. Has he taken any steps to expand the restorative justice programs on a larger scale? Obviously, I know things are a little crazy right now with COVID, but do you have any sense of an expansion of the programs once we kind of get out of this uncertainty?
I have not had the privilege of meeting with Mr. Ishii yet. I know who he is because of my new relationship with Tim Moose, who's a deputy secretary over the Department of Corrections right now. Through my conversations with Mr. Moose and his leadership team, I absolutely think that these programs will be expanding in our prison system. I think they re-invited us in a pretty big way. It wasn't, my first ask of Mr. Moose was to go back on death row, at which he said yes. My second ask was to get involved in women's prison, and he said yes, and he didn't just say yes, but he said let's try to do a couple of circles. And they established those. We weren't able to get started because the pandemic came and everything shut down. But there were 3 circles in 2 prisons that were ready to go. People had been chosen. We were ready to go. We just weren't able to implement because of the COVID pandemic. But there was also conversation about doing reentry circles in some prisons in North Carolina that have been established as reentry prisons. And I think, and that, you know, I kind of alluded to that with a kid that may have been taken out of a school environment, and then a way to re-enter them back into a school environment through re-entry circles and support teams and that sort of thing. And it's the same concept with re-entry circles in these re-entry prisons, where people are transferred into a facility that's in the community that they're going to be released into. And so instead of waiting until they're released and having them try to rebuild a lot of burned bridges and find support, let's try to build that support ahead of time while they're still in prison. Let's invite folks from the community and family members who they might have difficulty re-engaging with. Let's try to help to rebuild those relationships and that support before they ever are released back into the community. So I definitely, through the conversations we've had with Mr. Moose and his team, see a desire to expand these kinds of things within our prison system.
You just said that the people were chosen to participate, and I kind of latched onto that because it takes me back to an earlier question I didn't have a chance to ask you. How are the inmates chosen to participate in these? And I guess that if this were to become part of sentencing, that restorative justice was part of the sentencing process, how would defendants be allowed, I guess, to participate in it and to make sure that they took the restorative justice process seriously and that it didn't become either just another box to tick or a way to break up the monotony of being in prison? How are the inmates chosen to participate and kind of, I guess, vetted in a way that they're doing it to actually grow?
Yeah, I wish Dr. Coons could answer this question because he was really in charge of that. And he's a psychologist. He worked with a psychology team. He worked with people that did a lot of programming. They knew which inmates may be more likely to be successful in a circle process. They know them. We don't know them. He offered to allow us to read the charts and so forth and make decisions. And we said, we don't want to do that. We trusted him and his team. They were doing remarkable work. They had the folks' best interest in mind. They wanted them to be able to grow and mature and do as well as possible. And we said, we will not hold any kind of veto power over any decision that you make. So they vetted them. They advertise it in the prison. People apply, and then they talk to them, and they decide who they think is going to be well suited to be able to be successful in a program like this, because it is difficult. This is one of the most emotional things you'll ever do. You're getting back in touch with some of the most traumatic things you've ever experienced in your life. I'll tell you one thing that Dr. Coons did. He actually brought us into the prison as we were thinking about doing this on death row. And he introduced us to a person who is on death row, who is much like Alim. He is a leader of men on death row. He is an extremely calming and mature and loving presence on death row. And we had a conversation with him about restorative justice and circles and what he thought, and actually got input from him about who he thought would be appropriate. And he was in our circle. He at the time, he didn't know if he would choose to be in the circle, but he decided he wanted to, and he was extremely influential. So that's the way. And we've been in other prisons. It's not just Central. We've been at Polk in the youth facility. We spent 5 years in the federal prisons in Butner, and each time the participants have been chosen by people that know them who work in the prison.
Tessie, I'm going to take this next question back to you first, since you are just like all of us here on the outside, and you found a way to get involved with this work. So, how can people get involved in restorative justice and/or both anti-racism work?
Well, a lot of communities do have restorative justice programs nearby that you can just look up. I looked up one as soon as I moved to Durham recently, and sure enough, we have Restorative Justice Durham. And so I signed up for it and have been participating in that and learning a lot. It's a really wonderful group. So hopefully there would be something local for you. As far as anti-racism work, I think that anti-racism work, it sort of depends on what background you're coming from. For a lot of white folks, I think the first step to anti-racism work is understanding our own place in racism and how we may perpetuate it even without meaning to. So reading about racism and how it can manifest and how biases can manifest in your behaviors, joining book clubs and discussion groups, I'm actually just wrapping up a discussion, an anti-racism book club on the book White Fragility, which I've been doing for 7 weeks. And it's been a really great experience with everyone involved just being very willing to take a really hard look at themselves and understand ourselves and how we need to change and give each other constructive criticism on how to do better. But there are also a lot of groups too that you can get involved with locally if you just look up anti-racism circles, anti-racism book groups. Some of the social justice movements have sort of a subsidiary anti-racism group within them. So I think that's a really good place to start, but an inward journey first before the outward journey if you're a white person. So I think it's really easy to get kind of excited about, oh, we got to do this stuff right now. I'm going to go out and get involved in all these organizations and do these things. But you've still got a lot of that racism internalized within you. And so you may even be continuing to cause harm if you're not really taking a good look at yourself first.
Donna, ask you the same question for folks who want to get involved. And I'll even expand that. If folks specifically wanted to somehow get involved with your clinic, is there a way that they can, or outside of that, do you have other recommendations aside from the ones that Tessie's just given us?
Well, I would say that I think Tessie has given a very good answer to the two questions, and yeah, I'm very tied into the restorative justice community in the state and in the country, and we are seeing it evolving, and you don't have to look nearly as hard these days as you did 20 years ago when we were first getting started to find a program. RJ Durham is awesome. I mean, they have grown so quickly, and anybody that lives in that area, that's a place to look. Dr. Kim Cook down at UNCW does an awful lot of work around restorative justice in circles in the Wilmington area. So she is a person that you could look to. Orange County has a dispute resolution center that's doing a lot of great work. Val Hansen is a friend and a colleague who is doing a lot of the great restorative justice work in that area. So there are emerging places. My clinic has a dual mission. We have a mission to provide the direct services where we can, but we also have a mission to help to empower and enable others to do this work as they see fit. And so certainly people can reach out to me. I'm on the website at the law school. My email address is there. I welcome people to reach out to me. And we do a lot of training. I do a lot of talking. I'm doing a talk tomorrow for the statewide PD Public Defenders Conference. I've got 2 talks that I'm doing next week via Zoom over in Orange, Chatham County, a community group on Monday, judges on Friday. So we do a lot of that work just to try to help people understand and empower them to do the work if they desire to do that. Another place that I would say that I see this taking a foothold is in a lot of faith communities, and so a lot of churches will reach out, and I'm happy to meet with them. And you know, right now it's more Zoom than anything else, but we're still doing an awful lot of that work.
Actually, for those of you, if you'll direct yourself to the chat, there's a couple of audience members who have shared organizations that they themselves may be involved with, faith organizations in particular, who are doing similar work. So if you want to just take your attention to the chat, and you can see those last 2 comments with some more just resources for you in the vein of faith organizations. Tessie, I'm going to take this question to you. So do you have any words of caution for those who are looking to get into kind of criminal justice reform activism and are hoping or looking to implement new reforms?
Yeah, there's no panacea and no silver bullets to this kind of thing. I'm definitely guilty of jumping on some new shiny thing that looks great, getting really excited about it, and then later on finding out the ways in which it sometimes even does perpetuate the very systems we're trying to change. So I definitely think it's really important to get involved and to try to change things, but to understand just how complicated this issue is, and that this really is going to be a very long-term solution. So move forward with caution, ask questions, don't assume that since something sounds amazing, then it must be. Do your homework and find out for yourself when you're moving forward with that.
Our next to the last question, and I think we've asked this every time we've met. So for our new audience that may not have seen our other three, what are some things that you wish the public knew about the criminal justice system, and how do you think basically our understanding of the criminal justice system has been warped by TV or the news and lack of direct experience with the criminal justice system? Tessie, you can answer that one first, and then John, if you want to answer the same question as well.
There's so many things. I think what I talked about last time was plea bargaining, how rare it is for cases to actually go to a trial where you have a prosecutor and a defense attorney and a judge and a jury. It's actually very rare. Over 90% of cases, criminal justice cases, are settled outside of that by bargains that take place between the lawyers, and people basically sign away their right to a trial. So that's something that I think people should know about. And also, just being a lobbyist, the number one thing that I learned is I went into lobbying very intimidated by the process, intimidated by legislators, thinking that I was too unimportant of a person to have an influence. Why would they listen to someone like me? But what I learned is that the legislators, they're regular people and they have regular jobs, which means that they specialize in that one particular area that they may work in, whether they're a nurse or whether they're a teacher. So they don't necessarily know any more than you or I about any other area. And yet they're expected to make laws, they consider hundreds of bills every single year for every topic you can imagine, from criminal justice to forestry and agriculture, all of it. And they don't necessarily know very much about those topics. And they also, because they're very busy at the legislature and it's sort of designed that way where it's like a constant hustle, they don't really have time to sit and even read a lot of the bills they're voting on. So you, as a citizen, you have the right to just walk into the legislature and talk to one of them, or call one of them on the phone, or email them and educate them on issues that they probably don't know very much about. And you might be the only person who educates them on that issue. So they actually are grateful for it, because I think deep down they feel a little bit bad about having to vote on bills that they haven't read or that they don't know much about. And so you being there and teaching them is a gift to them, and it's one that many of them really gratefully accept. So I would encourage people, don't feel intimidated. You are welcomed and you're needed at the legislature. So please go and be involved in that process, because they need you.
John, I asked the same question of you. What do you wish that we knew about the criminal justice system that we don't know? What do you wish the public knew?
Well, I'll go back to something that I said a while ago when I was talking about the three questions on either side of this equation. I want victims to know that the criminal legal system does not exist to serve their needs. It exists to identify what law's been broken, who did it, and what does that person deserve. We have made some strides in victim services, but I do think we've got a long way to go. I also hesitate to condemn people that work in this system. I think most people, just like Tessie was talking about a while ago, the legislators that we have are regular folks working other jobs and dealing with huge problems and trying to find solutions. Most people that work in government and our criminal system and in our schools are really good people. I know we've got some teachers from Wake County that are on this call right now who I know very well and love them dearly and admire the work that they do so much. It's difficult work. So I try not to condemn people that work in these systems that are not designed to do some of the things that we think they're designed to do. So understand, first of all, what the system is designed to do when you get dragged into it. I want to, you didn't specifically ask this question, Tessie, but Jessica, but a while ago you asked about words of caution. In restorative justice, one of the words of caution that I would have is When Alim was talking about how he had written letters to victims a while ago, my stomach knotted up a little bit because restorative justice needs to be a victim-driven and a victim-centered practice. We can do an awful lot of harm if we come at it from the offender side, going to a victim that does not welcome that sort of thing. Sounds like the outcomes so far and what Alim have done have been okay, and I'm glad for that. But it goes back to the question you asked earlier about, do I see Alim's story of remorse as a common story from the people that we work with in prison, and I do. And they wish they could do, they all want to reach out to their victims. That's why we need a protocol in our state that establishes, first of all, the knowledge to victims that this exists. This is something that people don't know about and haven't thought about and would never think about. They know what's offered to them, and this is not offered to them. So we need a protocol that offers this to them so that victims can reach out and say, this is something that I want to explore. It's what Linda Simmons did when she had reached a point in her healing process that she felt like what she had to have next was some answers and some dialogue with the man that had killed her son. And she reached out, and that is the best way to do this. So a protocol in our state to be able to do that is something that is much needed.
I think that's a really powerful point to make, that it has to be victim driven, because of, I would say, an inmate at some point may come to that point where they want to assuage their guilt, they want to complete their healing process, but ultimately they are still the ones that committed a horrible act, and it's not necessarily their place to go back to the family and ask for forgiveness. It's the victim's family to give it in their own time, in their own way. And I think that's really powerful to just remember that, you know, not that the inmates don't deserve their own healing, but that it may not necessarily involve the families. You know, they may have to come to that place in a different way. You know, so I think that's really powerful. We are almost out of time. So the final thing that I would ask of both of you, and John, I'll just keep it here with you for another few seconds. Is there anything that you've got coming up? Any events? I'm assuming they would be virtual. Anything that you've got going on that you want us to know about? And then I'll take it to you, Tessie, with the same thing.
Yeah, it's a different world that we live in today than a year ago. I mean, you know, a year ago, we had a hard time finding a place on the calendar to do everything. These events, like what we're doing tonight, doing these things virtually, I think can be very effective. And I'm so glad that we are learning the technology and have the availability, and folks like you, Jessica, that are hosting these things and inviting folks in. It can be very effective. You know, I mentioned a couple things that I'm doing in the next few days. You won't be invited to the Public Defenders Conference tomorrow, but that's something that I hope will be good for a lot of public defenders across the state of North Carolina to learn about restorative justice. There are community events, I think, all the time, and I'm happy to talk to anybody. I mean, I got a vehicle that loves to travel. I'm happy to sit as long as we can be safely social distance. I've done some circles recently where we were able to do that. I'm happy to do virtual presentations. I did one for an Episcopal church in North Raleigh about 2 weeks ago. I've got another one on the books to do for the Mennonite church in downtown Raleigh in about a week. I've got 2 events in Orange County next week. So, and you know, I'm happy if anybody's interested, shoot me an email and I'll give you more detail.
And you, Tessie?
Yeah, so I have a couple things going on. We have a running book club for Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row, where all 4 of the co-authors call in. So we meet once a week for 5 weeks, and we meet to discuss the section that was written by that particular person on death row, and then they will call in just like Alim did today. And there's this really amazing opportunity for dialogue where you can actually ask your questions directly to the author, and they can answer them. And those have been really, really powerful. Alim calls in during week 3 of that process. We've had sessions where just people are crying. I mean, it's really an amazing experience, and it's completely free. So you can sign up on my website to do that. Our next one actually starts this coming Thursday, August 27th. And then when one ends, we start another one after that. So that's a great opportunity. Also, We're also doing events, virtual events. So we're speaking at schools, we're speaking at churches, we're speaking to nonprofits, we're speaking to private book clubs that people put together. And so if anybody is interested in having us come speak, we do exactly what you just saw happen. Is that I call in, and then one of my co-authors calls in over the phone, and we patch them into Zoom, and we can speak on specific topics such as the death penalty or restorative justice or solitary confinement, criminal justice reform, life without parole, or we can do just sort of an informal Q&A with my co-author. What is life like on death row? How did you get on death row? And those can also be really powerful. So please reach out to me again on my website if you want us to come and do a virtual event for you. And of course, you can also buy the book on the website as well. So I'll provide those links.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John and Tessie, for being here with us today. It was really great to spend time with you. I'm very, very thankful that we were able to hear from Alim, and honestly that we were able to hear from all four of your co-authors over the course of this series. So I'll remind everyone that all of these have been recorded. The first three in the series are on our website, greensborobound.com. I'd also just want to remind you that all of these events are provided completely free. Greensboro Bound is a nonprofit organization, and it's really only through gifts from donors that we are able to do this work and continue to offer these events. All of our events throughout the history of Greensboro Bound have always been offered completely free to our audience. We don't charge anything, whether we're on Zoom or whether we are able to meet in person. And so I just ask you to please consider, if you can, if you're financially able to consider a gift to Greensboro Bound. Any amount helps us. You can also stay connected with us through our social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram. We have a YouTube channel, again, and that's where all of these videos, including all of the rest of our authors' series, is on there as well, fiction writers predominantly. And so you can stay in touch with us, see everything else that we have coming up. This is the last of our original summer series, which was just to kind of get us what we thought would be getting us over the hump of COVID. That has turned out to not be the case. So we are now heading into our fall series, and we have some really, really great authors lined up. The predominant theme of our fall series is going to be, no surprise, but voting rights, social inequity, all of the things that kind of tie into those same themes. And our first event is actually going to be on September 17th at 7 p.m. And that's author Aaron Geiger-Smith, who wrote a book called Thank You for Voting, and Gilda Daniels, who wrote a book called Uncounted. So again, if you have not liked or followed our Facebook or Instagram, please jump on there. We'll have all the information about these upcoming events. If you go to our website, again, that's greensborobound.com, you can sign up for our newsletter. We're going to stay here. We're going to continue to do this online thing as long as we need to, and we hope to keep you guys coming back for more. So yeah, check that out. This video will be posted in probably a couple weeks or so. We'll also include Tessie's website will be included in part of the video. I'll also include a link to the Restorative Justice Clinic. But as John and Tessie both said, in the meantime, reach out to them, get in touch, keep doing the good work. John and Tessie, directly, thank you again so much for your time. Tessie, we've spent a lot of hours together here lately, so I appreciate that. It's been great to get to know you. And yeah, everybody just stay safe out there. Remember your 3 W's. Wear your mask, wash your hands, and wait 6 feet apart. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.